And even if it is, they're going to look at it from the narrative of this is business. They're not going to look at it from the narrative of how that business impacts people, right? And so that type of understanding can only really come from people that are invested. And it could come from people that are, that their parents are from overseas or whatever, but they have to be invested. You understand what I'm saying? I think that
model of a business, a corporation, all that stuff is really from Western thought. And I don't think we realize how rooted that stuff's become in our mind. You think about the medieval period, Islamic period, al-Qaf, the waqf, the endowment, which is basically like a nonprofit, was the dominant model of the economy. You had people who were like traders and merchants and things like that. But you talking in the medieval period, like more than 65% of the land tied up in al-Qaf. That's what Islamic history talks to us about, right? I mean, I don't understand why we always, I guess it's just kind of the American Protestant anti-intellectualist attitude. I think a lot of American Muslims were so caught up in these Western modes of thinking, and we're so detached from our own history, from our own epistemologies, that we can't even get out of this, mentality. That's the only way some people can see the world. It's all they've ever known.
The intellectuals are not there to intellectuals, I should say the institutions, and the institution doesn't have to be brick and mortar. It can be these types of relationships. This is not the type of conversation that many of the Muslims are having.
No, you don't see this conversation in the masjid oftentimes.
And then if it's a flowing, fluid conversation, what I've seen usually it means that those Muslims have been educated somehow into what's going on in the society. But it's not necessarily that they're bringing an Islamic identity to that. It just, the default is that they happen to be Muslim having this type of conversation. But it's not coming from it's not that they're trying to articulate a Muslim position. You get what I'm saying? It's like it's somebody that is, you went and you joined some social justice group, or you're part of this community relations organization, but it doesn't mean that it's an intentional, thought out identity as a Muslim. Of what you were saying, of digging back in the crate, so to speak. You go back into Ghazali, you know what I'm saying? And then you remix it, you know what I'm saying? Like you play that DJ role where you go back into the past and you pull out from the tradition, like you were talking about Ghazali and Palisi. This is not a new reality for us. So what will happen is that what will happen is that a segment of the Muslim community, we talk about policing as an example, which is the topic of this conversation at the core, or one of them at the core. They will say this is a leftist agenda, and they don't realize that in the tradition itself is a topic. You understand what I'm saying?
A critique of policing in the medieval period. It was always an issue when authority oversteps its bounds. It happens.
Yeah, I think that what you were saying, the issue about understanding history, is something that there is something that has been shaped in this country that's important to understand. Is that in the American experiment, there's certain things that have been achieved through struggle, whether it's workers' rights, you know what I'm saying, whether it's civil human rights. That wasn't just something that was bestowed necessarily 100% by the Constitution, that was framed by certain people, certain groups with interests. Coal miners had to develop certain rights. Union workers, they had to struggle for certain articulations of things. And so,
We have just a history of massive struggle in this country to get what we consider the most basic rights that we have today.
Right, and that's not the historical experience or reality of the Muslim community. That's just not how they do things.
Yep.
And that's something that I think that will remain a point of discussion, that when we start talking about
the Black Muslims have been our leaders in regards to that, and they're often marginalized and ignored by the immigrant community in that regard.
In what sense?
like I've met Black Muslims that, they're like fourth generation Muslims, and their family was part of all these, civil rights, different organizations and movements. They've been there from the beginning, and we're sitting here and, not learning from them. We're not giving them the proper respect and the pedestal and the microphone that they deserve oftentimes. Even when I think about here in Minnesota, the African American Muslims, they kind of have like their own masjid on the north side, and you don't really see like a lot of cross interaction between them and the immigrant community, unfortunately. It's like everybody stick to themselves mentality, which I see all over the country. I've seen it in Chicago. I've seen it in upstate New York. I've seen it in Florida. Like I've seen it all different Muslim communities around the country. Like when are we gonna try to get out of that? And of course, the government puts policies in place to make us segregated, but we have to try to resist all these things. Is the way I feel about it.
Yeah, you know what? I'm gonna take a more of a right-wing stance on that issue. That the government may create policies like that, but the religion itself dictates interaction.
Of course.
And so there becomes the issue of people,
different tribes to know one another.
Yeah, and so that becomes the issue of where people are responsible for themselves in that regard.
For sure.
I can make an excuse, but in reality, it feels, because when I came into Islam as a Muslim, I was open to learning about different communities. And I'll never forget what one of my friends, brother, mentor at the same time, comrades type of a thing, like African American brother. I never forget what he said. He used to tell me, because we've had for years now, a couple decades, we've had the whole conversation, the role of culture in Islam, and the role of ethnicity and all of that. And one of the things that he said is that he told me on a personal level, he has talked to the immigrant community. He said, I have taken out, he's very educated, well-established brother, middle class, and he has said typical, suburban American type of thing now, and I have to bring up that background because people have a certain stereotype when you bring up the African American community. But he has said, look, I've taken out the time intentionally to come to know your history, your culture, your background, but it hasn't been mutual. And to be, up to date on what your situation in the world politically, and what your status is, but it hasn't been mutual. And I think that mutuality, that point of the lack of mutuality is something which is problematic. Mm-hmm. And that happens many times with the converts, or people, they read and they study, and they read and they study, but they don't have a personal experience. I know a brother was trying to tell me, like, I know everything about Latin Americans. He told me that recently. But it's like, okay, but what's your interaction with the community? You see what I'm saying? It could be the same thing. Another person comes in.
So you made them an object of study. So what?
Yeah. I know everything about European Americans. I know everything, about Black Americans. I know everything, but what's your relationship? We're talking about Muslims. I'm here. I'm bracketing this off the stage.
Okay. A tajriba, the experiential knowledge. Knowledge isn't only just what's in books. Mm-hmm. You can make a group of people your object to study. Well, then you're just like the Orientalist. But where are you engaging with those people and sitting with those people, loving those people, caring for those people? It's different.
And that is the reality. We can never have collaboration and solidarity under the idea of ta'awun. I believe that ta'awun talks about mutual aid, and it talks about solidarity, and it talks about cooperation. But I think that we can never have that, in the real sense, if we don't have relationships to one another. And I think that that's what we're feeling in the Muslim community right now, that we don't have real tangible relationships, and we won't get them because the ethnic divisions. We have to remember that the convert is coming in on a prophetic model. The convert is coming in through a prophetic model, meaning that converts are coming in self-examining themselves and their culture, right? And they are coming in many cases, leaving off certain things of their culture to come into Islam. It's like the report on the New York Times said about the immigrant community, that many of them have Islam as an inherent identity. It's not a living identity that they're building themselves out of. And so we have to remember, intermarriage is not necessarily something which is, a dominant paradigm when it comes to, so that, some people say, well, you guys created this indigenous immigrant divide, right? No, it's not the indigenous immigrant divide that's created intentionally. It's one that is maintained. You know what I'm saying? And we're not necessarily maintaining it because many of us that convert to Islam, we're trying to understand where there's openness in the different communities. Those different communities are the ones that are maintaining those barriers because they have rules. Like when you look at some iterations of Hanafi fiqh, when you start talking about compatibility, especially when you start talking about some iterations of Hanafi fiqh coming out of the subcontinent, the Indian subcontinent, they'll say that al-kafah or compatibility is not there if generationally there's no equivalence between when your great-grandfather became Muslim and that person that you want to marry when that great-grandfather for that person became Muslim. And so they will say that there's no compatibility based on that type of thing. So there's certain things in their understanding where even when it comes to the issue of compatibility, they block out the possibility of intermarriage even amongst themselves. You understand what I'm saying? So that's never going to get us to a point. It's never going to get us to a point of coming to know one another. And this is exactly the crux that we could talk about from the sociological angle. This is the same issue that we were talking about. Are these stores which are open to get to know the community and the community getting to know these stores so there can be some collaboration? It's the same principle, it's just in a different set of relationships, right? In a different set of relationships. And here we're talking about the issue of marriage and group dynamics. Over there, we're talking about the issue of institutions of business and the role of the community. But at the end of the day, it's about coming to know one another. If people like yourself and others don't articulate these points, I don't think that they will be articulated in a clear way. So there's some brothers I have seen from overseas that are interested in that articulation, and that's mostly because they have, in many ways, accepted that they're part of this community. They're not in the two world phase. You know what I'm saying? They've accepted that this is where we're at, and this is where we're going to be at, and this is how we're going to function.
I feel like the Somali youth in Minnesota are at that stage, and that's why they've been such a prominent part of the protests. It's pretty noticeable there's a generational difference. The old people are not out on the streets protesting. The people who are like 35 and above, it's a lot of times the younger people who are out there trying to help the community, trying to make all these interconnections, trying to know one another. A lot of the older people have this Kahoti mentality. That's the Somali word for refugee. Like they're like, oh, we're just here temporarily, make some money, we're gonna go back to Somalia. Dude, it's been like 15 years. Like, what are you talking about? Like when you're 70, your retirement, or like, what's that all about? And it's kind of like a cognitive dissonance that's going on. And I see this in other immigrant communities as well that are not refugees. They don't see their maybe it's an identity issue. I don't know, but some of them they don't.
It goes back to what we were saying about in group, out group. And the whole how every group has gone through their trial by fire and how they deal with situations here. But I think that part of the dilemma is that the leadership is not articulated. The intellectual leadership is not articulating what it is that people go through and having these conversations of how you navigate. Many times these types of feelings and these orientations are silently lived out, or they're discussed in tight circles, right, due to privacy issues or whatever it may be, or due to custom. but then we're not discussing as a community our role, right? And that, again, that takes us back to the issue of the role of the Muslim Americans. What is the role of these stores? What is the role of the masjid? We're still stuck on trying to understand what is our role and our responsibility, because remember that prior to 9/11, a significant amount of the Muslim community never saw themselves as part of the society. It was that event, that 9/11 event, which forced people to rethink. You know what I'm saying? And sometimes the intention wasn't necessarily, it wasn't an intention that came out of commitment. It was an intention that came out of survival. And those are two different realities. It was, or we can say, commitment to survival, not commitment to understand and develop and grow and respond, and right, what you were saying about rights and responsibilities. Right? What are my responsibilities, and what are others' rights over me?
And what's our legacy too, as a historian, right, who's looking to the past all the time. I'm thinking about how our future historians 500 years ago studying about Islam in America, what are they going to say about us?
I think that is important. That's why I think that is important as converts, for as much life as we may have. Yeah, I think as converts, that one of the things that we have to do, which has not really been done, is that we have to articulate these issues. Mm-hmm. Because what that does is, for better or worse, it gives a platform of dialogue for the next generations that will come, so they're not starting from zero, so that they know that there's some continuity of thought and experience, that they don't have to necessarily accept it, or they don't necessarily have to reject it, but it gives them something to work with. Like, is a concept of an experiential toraf, or an experiential legacy, like what you're saying, that they can inherit and that they can work with. And people have tried in some ways. I like the work that Andrew March is doing. I don't know if you're familiar with Andrew March's work. Andrew March, he's doing some work in academia. He did one that's called Islam and Liberal Citizenship. He has about 2 books. But Islam and Liberal Citizenship is a masterpiece which should be studied for understanding Muslims in America. Except that I feel that it doesn't document enough the African American community's experience, but it's still a start. Even Susie Ismail, in her book on, the issue of divorce, it articulates, it's almost like a ethnological study. It maybe sometimes the framework is not something that's suitable to academia, not as tight as academia would want it. But it's those types of discourses. But, there's some biographies as well. There's some biographies that have been written by some African-American women, and their journey to Islam and their growing up and even growing out of Islam. But those things are important for us to be able to have these narratives, whether some of them are more on the intellectual, analytical side, or some more of them are on the, ethnological, almost like vignette type of style, biographical style. That's what Ghazali did. Imam al-Ghazali did that, in Deliverance from Error. He did an intellectual biography that was his engagement with society and his working out of his issues. And he left something for future generations to deal with, where they can deal with the internal tensions on the psychological, spiritual level, and they can deal with some principles, on the intellectual level.
And he wasn't the first one to do it. Al-Hakim at Tirmidhi, the earlier like Sufi figure, he had that same autobiography too. This is something that's a part of our tradition. And the thing about Al-Munqidh min ad-Dalal, the deliverance from error, that I find so special is not only does he talk about his own internal conflicts, but he's also talking about external conflicts, dealing with the Ismailis, became known as the assassins, that were a threat in Iran. How do we argue and debate with them in a nice way to convince them, hey, I think you're a little mistaken right there. He dealt with every different sect. He dived into it, learned it, and had principles to how to deal with those different groups. You know,
it's funny that you bring that up, because Ibn Tufayl wrote a book where he talks about his intellectual journey. And actually it was the Orientalist, one of the Jewish Orientalists was translated it, and also the Conference of the Birds. Even if people may not agree with some of the mystical tendencies, but in that format, which Dr. Khalid Abul Fadl ended up writing the Conference of the Books in that format, in which he's dialoguing with his library and all of these tendencies in Islamic thought and his reality as being a professor in California of Islamic studies and being involved in that community that's there, of how do you negotiate. We don't have to agree with his conclusions, but is the format and the idea that there's different platforms that we can use. There's different paradigms that we can use to deal with these issues. Whether it's a movie to work out the conflict of being a Muslim in the inner city and you're going to this store. There's actually recently a commercial that was published or that was produced. And that commercial shows some young African-American boys going into the store, and the initial presentation, it makes them almost look like they're gang members. But then, as the commercial proceeds on, it shows that people have their biases and they perceive them to be in that way, but they're just youth that are just, involved in their life, activities, and they're going to a store to go buy something. They're not necessarily criminals. But the idea of film, you know what I'm saying, working out those narratives, the idea of film of working out those themes and topics, that this is where we as a Muslim community don't have the complete civilizational package. We're automatically thinking civilization is, the political side, but the issue of the art side and the role of the arts and the different genres to be able to articulate our issues are not there. We don't even have a solid treatise on political engagement in the U.S. Aside from what I was seeing from Islam and Liberal Citizenship, which is a book about this thick, maybe about almost 300 pages, which documents Muslims in the U.S., different fatwa and different ideas that Muslims have put forward towards political participation. We're knocking people that are going into politics, but we ourselves are not clear what it means to go into politics in the U.S. These ethical dilemmas, like this nuance that you brought to us about what's going on, in the Twin Cities with regard to that store and this interaction, a lot of times we don't have platforms to articulate these issues, where other people, they have books, they have radio shows, they have films, they have TV. You know what I'm saying? They have music. They're doing it in a number of different ways. Our expression is extremely limited. And the convert is allowing himself or herself to be limited. Although we know that all of those genres exist. We know the importance of all of those different platforms. We know the importance of having that breadth to engage. We come into Islam, we become like this, intellectually and emotionally, experientially. And that's why I think a lot of us are lost, and in this situation right now, we need these voices, because we need to know what activism is. We need to know what community engagement is. We need to know our responsibility as Muslims. And we also need to be able to address this conflict that we have internally in the Ummah between the different groups, whether culturally or not.
I feel like we're so caught up in responding to everything at the political level because it's a vestige of colonialism. And I think that often Muslims, we forget that revolution has two different sides to it. You have the cultural revolution as well as the political revolution. And if we want to have an impact on American society that reflects our own values, we can do that through culture as well. It doesn't only have to be through political activism.
I want you to build that out, because that has been a topic among some brothers for a while now, that even the concept of revolution is not necessarily, taking things out and, but it is a transformative process.
It's like Tajdeed, renewal.
Okay, can you explain that for us a little bit? or to us?
No, there's a hadith that goes something like, every 100 years, a mujaddid will come who can, revive or renew the religion. And that same attitude, I think we need to have culturally, not just when it comes to like the ulum ad-din, like we have the famous book, Ihya ulum ad-din, that's kind of the title, revival of the religious sciences kind of comes from that spirit of tajdeed. But tajdeed didn't only happen in Islamic society at this, intellectual, Islamic science type level. It also happened culturally with poetry, literature, and historical biographies and many different things that nowadays might be called like secular sciences. In the pre-modern period, it was all just we all learned it, the ulama learned it, everybody just read this stuff. Ibn Hazm, he was just as much of a literary person as he was a religious scholar. And I think we've lost that nowadays. You got people that just go to the madrasa, they memorize some mutun, they come out, they just want to be like an imam at the masjid, and maybe they start reading some shuruh or something later in life. But it's like, we need to go way beyond that. Where else are we contributing to society besides just, like ulum ad-din? You know what I mean? Look at people like Tayyib Saleh from Sudan and his, books about culture and colonialism and those types of things. We can produce literature like that, from an Islamic framework that can be part of cultural change and renewal.
I think that there's a lot of concepts that have come out of this discussion that may necessitate revisiting the discussion and having and compiling a tract, some sort of basic tract. It doesn't even have to be anything very complicated. It could be maybe a page and a half, maybe 3 pages or something, of some points of where we should be focusing on, right? Kind of for instance, some sort of convert manifesto of where we should be focusing on, because there's a lot of disorientation, you know what I'm saying? And then along with that, there is the issue of personal development and everything that comes along with that. But as far as a general framework of how we should be looking at society and our commitment and how we should look at knowledge, because I agree with you 100%. I personally believe that Ibn Khaldun, he articulates that knowledge, is either based in revelation or based in intellect. There's not a tension between the different realms of knowledge. Even Ibn Taymiyyah argued that point, that there's not a tension. I think people confuse what Imam al-Ghazali rahmatullahi alayhi has said about, and I've struggled with that concept myself, that there's religious knowledge or there's knowledge of the deen and that there's knowledge of dunya. Even the understanding what deen means and what dunya means is not necessarily the understanding that al-Ghazali rahmatullahi alayhi had. We're giving the understanding of deen one meaning and the understanding of dunya another meaning, because actually when we look back, dunya is just a temporary realm. And so, but we're giving it this
we're getting
idea
caught
that
up in the ideas of the Enlightenment, secular versus religious, that did not
exist period. And that's something that I think that we should have a discussion on, that are we even really understanding the tradition properly? Did Imam al-Ghazali rahmatullahi alayhi, because I was stuck on that issue for a while myself, it have the translations of these terms, whether they're into Urdu or whether they're into English or whatever, outside of the Arabic, when we stop using the roots of the Arabic language for the meaning of deen and the meaning of dunya, and then we give these terms an ideological layer that doesn't belong to them, is that an alienation of generation? Because in many ways, what that has done is that has created, another tradition, which is really not the tradition itself, is a misreading of the tradition. And Umberto Eco, he has a book called Serendipities. And in the book called Serendipities, he talks about this problem of language. Umberto Eco, he kind of is in between postmodernism and medieval studies. So it's very interesting the parallels that he draws as an Italian philosopher, but in cultural critic. he was the one that was behind the film The Name of the Rose. I don't know if you've ever seen that film, but you should check it out. It's an interesting film. It deals with the life of an academic monk in a time period of turmoil. But that's a different issue. But Umberto Eco, he talks about how misusage of terms or ideas can lead you into a whole different trajectory from where you could be in. It could be positive or negative. But I think this misusage here, which is very irresponsible, and is upheld by certain religious understandings and interpretations, like, for instance, the concept of the madrasa being the realm of Islam, and then the dunya, there's these ideas, the way that we talk about the dunya, that is like, almost like it's not the creation of Allah. And it has its beauty and its goodness in it. It has led to a secularization, which is worse than the secularization process that the European Enlightenment brought about. Because the European Enlightenment, in some cases, the secularization process got us closer to Islam coming out of the Christian trajectory. Whereas this idea that Muslims are imposing on the world, this type of secularism, that's secularized way of thinking, is actually bastardizing our existence. And it's making it as though nothing is worth anything except just prayer, and kind of just going into your own realm. And what that does is it creates two ethical realms. One, the realm of the, do whatever you need to do to make money, forget about everybody, forget about society. And the other realm is, okay, I'm Muslim, and this is my practice of the deen, and I have to preserve it. And so that colonial strategy, which came from some, even from scholars, maybe that's not what they originally intended, but that's where we're at with it now. It is in part what exists in our community here in the US. And it's in part what doesn't allow us to dialogue on these issues. So that, for instance, if you bring out a book on policing, you say, what does that have to do with Islam? If you bring out a book with, well, what is social responsibility, or what does that have to do with Islam? If you bring out a book on, the responsibility that we have to build neighborhoods and communities, what is, why are we talking about dealing with the non-Muslims? And that's an actual reality. Like, we've had with the 3 Puerto Rican imams, Imam Wesley himself went to an organization, a masjid, which shall be named unmentioned, remain unmentioned. And he asked them for some food stuff at the peak of COVID in the beginning, so that we can help. He asked them if they want to participate in our food distribution program to the elderly. And the local government was encouraging that. They actually gave the organization names of elderly people that needed the assistance. So they opened the door for the Muslims, and there was not like government interference. It was just like issue. Can you guys literally deal with these elderly people, that we're in the midst of a crisis? And that representative of that institution said, we don't deal with non-Muslims. That angered so many of us. You understand what I'm saying? It set us ablaze that in the midst of crisis, you can betray the ethics of Islam that talk about saving a life to say, well, we can only deal with that person if that person is from our religious persuasion. And I'll say it like this, some people may say it's uncouth, but that well knowing that we don't even deal with the Muslims at that level. We don't even help the Muslims at that level with that level of commitment. Yeah. So that, in terms of saying that we only help the Muslims. And many times the Muslims are going to the Christians to get help.
Yeah, ain't nobody getting help. We're going to Catholic charities, like.
Yeah, right? So I believe personally that, I believe there's a connection between that orientation and that bastardized way of thinking about religiosity, and the world itself. And that, again, when you talk about, epistemology, when you talk about the indigenous community dealing with epistemology, or how do we deal with knowledge? How do we understand knowledge? How do we understand ideas? How do we investigate the Quran and the Sunnah? How do we investigate the tradition? How do we apply these things to life? I think that's where we meet the roadblock, because we have this culture which is upholding these types of concepts which go unquestioned.